In his first year as offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals, in shocking news, Dan Pitcher would like the Bengals offense to be more explosive. Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco. He's your host, James Rapine. Our combine coverage continues, and we're going to have some more thoughts on some Bengals coaches' comments out of Indianapolis on the Locked On Bengals podcast today, which you can find on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. We appreciate all you everydayers out there and everyone who makes us their first listen. Today's episode is sponsored by FanDuel, where you can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet right now. $150 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com/lockedon with any winning $5 bet. And James, let's start with Dan Pitcher, who I thought, and you guys should just go listen to the entire interview that James has posted on Cincinnati Bengals Talk on YouTube, because I thought Dan was a pretty interesting listen. Talked about explosiveness, talked about offensive line play, talked about some of their self-scouting this offseason. What stood out to you the most?
Yeah, I think, one, he's going to be such a good match in fit. And we know that, right? It's not like he's new to what the Bengals do, but I just think how, one, he's obviously a really smart guy, really smart offensive mind, but he wants to do whatever it's going to take to win that week. And he really reiterated that throughout the process when asked about Joe Burrow's willingness to change and do different things. And it's like, look, we just want to win this week. And then next week we may have to do something different and we'll be empty 1 week. And then 1 week we won't be. And I do think that from that perspective, having him in an elevated role, we could see a different offense. Not completely different, I don't mean that, but just different elements to this offense where they're going to look at everything. And obviously the explosive plays, finding ways to generate them on the ground and through the air. It's something they have to do. They have to be better at it. And when you do that, it hides other flaws. And the Bengals are going to have flaws next year. They're not going to be perfect. Spoiler alert. And so it would certainly be nice on offense if they could produce more explosive plays. But I just really think this is the second time, obviously, we've talked to Dan since he was hired and promoted to offensive coordinator. I think he's going to be a really good fit, and I think it's going to work out really well. And those that were on board with the hire, I think he's going to deliver.
You talk about the game-to-game game planning. I think that's been a feature of this offense for years. I think that has been an underrated aspect of this offense, and a lot of people are overly critical or overly praiseful, that's not the word I want, of the changes of the offense when Jake Browning took over and the way they did things differently. A lot of that is to do with the opponent. A lot of their rushing success last year was to do with opponent and game planning against those opponents. We talked about the kinds of teams that were good running the ball against last year, but another thing that stood out before we talk about the interesting answer he gave when talking about the self-scout and where they're looking to get better, that kind of illustrates his understanding of some of the advanced stats out there and how those relate to the self-scout process. And you can hear, if you know what you're listening for, you can hear some of the tools they're using too, which is kind of cool. But he was asked about being an 11 personnel heavy team and talking about the possibility of acquiring a tight end. And he's like, look, we're player focused. We're going to put our best players on the field. If we were to go out there and get a really high-end tight end, and of course he can't name names, so he didn't, but I can name names. So if they were to go out and get Brock Bowers, say, I can't think of another one that's realistic. And
you forgot his name for a second there.
No, I didn't.
That was good.
I was going to say Travis Kelce, but I was like, you can't get Travis Kelce. You can't get George Kittle. So like, it doesn't make sense to say those. So then I came back to the one that they could get, which is Brock Bowers.
Yeah.
So if you could get a player like that, he's like, yeah, we played more 12 if that's what we had to do. We're going to put our best players on the field. We've just had 3 receivers that we want to put on the field. And that's kind of the long and short of it. And maybe has skewed our perspective a little bit of what we think the Zach Taylor, Brian Callahan, Dan Pitcher offense is, to be more 11 personnel heavy, more shotgun heavy than perhaps it would be in a neutral situation where Joe Burrow doesn't get hurt and the roster is constructed a little bit differently.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's something we've discussed, but he's pretty open about it. And he believes in 11, by the way. And maybe that's what happens. Maybe they draft Malachi Corley, right? Let's just say.
Which
and
would fit the explosiveness theme, the way that explosives happen in the NFL now, where you're doing it a lot after the catch. Sorry, continue.
No, it would fit. So let's just say they take him at pick 49, because that's where I think they would have to take him. There you go. There's the take at this point. And that could change. And maybe he falls to 80. But pick 49, they take Malachi Corley, and he's this plug-and-play slot. Well, they're probably still going to play a lot of 11. But if they take Brock Bowers, or if they take someone, a playmaking tight end, or they add Noah Fant, and they're like, oh, man, Noah Fant for $9 million a year, that's a steal. Well, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not going down that road.
Doing this again?
But no, we're not. But if they do that, let's just say they spend $9 million a year to tight end. Well, they're probably going to lean on that tight end a bit more, or have plans to get the tight end more involved and be part of the offense, especially if they don't invest a high pick or free agent money capital into the slot position and are relying on Charlie Jones or relying on Jamar Chase to move into the slots. So I do think that the willingness to change based on the players and personnel is certainly there. And it is, to me, that is refreshing. Where, and we talked about it on yesterday's show, how what Zach Taylor at the end of the show, Zach Taylor and who he hired and all of those things. But I know he's here and he's been in Cincinnati. But what Dan Pitcher said, some of it is refreshing. And I do think it is the self-scout, self-look that they need to evolve into that next phase of whatever that is on offense.
And this is what coaches will say every year at this time of year. So again, it could be coach speak, just like I said yesterday about Zach's comments at the end of the show. It could just be coach speak, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to change appreciably or noticeably or in a way that would actually necessarily be a net positive for the Bengals, right? But the fact that they're saying it at least means that there's an openness there and they're going through the process. And I think using the right tools and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more as well, and kind of the way they're going through the self-scout, because it is deep and maybe you're not familiar as someone who is listening to the show in terms of the way that they go about their self-scout process and all the different splits that they're looking at. Cause that's kind of a simplified way to do it, is they're talking about, when they talk about third down success, they're not talking about just third downs. They're talking about third and long, third and medium, third and short. They're talking about the score of the game at that junction, the part of the field they're on. They're looking at these things in a pretty high level of granular detail when they're going through the self-scout and identifying these areas for improvement. So it was interesting to hear Dan talk about some of those as well, in addition to talking about the desire to get more explosive and utilize their players a little bit better. So we'll hear from Dan Pitcher and that interesting quote and talk about that a little bit before getting into this tackle class and the opportunity that potentially is ahead of the Bengals in the draft, and some of the punter questions and Darrin Simmons' comments on that topic in the rest of the show coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book, and right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So throw $5 on the Warriors, throw $5 on any NBA team. Baseball's right around the corner as well, and you win, and you get $150 in bonus bets from UFC to boxing. It's all there with FanDuel, and you can bet on all your favorite NBA players with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and so much more. Jake, I got to make my wagers for today. I've been getting in on the NBA action with FanDuel, and you can too. All you have to do is go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to shoot your shot, and new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA.
I thought that we got a great answer from Dan Pitcher, and shockingly, James, it came from one of your questions. Good job. And
shockingly. All right.
That was sarcasm. And
Noted.
What made it great actually is that he kind of veered off of what you asked. You asked kind of what were the positive takeaways from the self scout, and he started talking about that a little bit, but then he started talking about a lot of areas for improvement as well, which tells you about the mindset of this coaching staff this offseason as well. Talked about that with Zach yesterday, where and Duke yesterday, where they look at 9-8 and they look at their expectations and performance last year. They're disappointed. So I thought this was a pretty interesting and long answer from Dan Pitcher that gives some interesting insight into what they're doing right now.
Sure. You look at both phases, right? You look at the run game, you look at the pass game. Run game first. We have been a very efficient rushing offense. When you look at some of the context-dependent metrics, the EPA, efficiency, chunk percentage, things like that, there's good stuff there, and then you break it down by, specific run scheme. Some things we were good at, others we weren't. And so those are the kind of the findings that allow you to forge the path forward. Kind of common themes, obviously we'd love to be more explosive, even so we kind of divided up efficiency, chunk is kind of intermediate category, and then explosive runs. If we can turn some of those efficient runs into chunk runs, and that's a team-wide thing. That's every position on the field. It's the line maybe straining to finish a little bit. It's the back, making somebody miss at the second level. It's the quarterback making sure we're in the right checks. It's the receivers finishing. I think we did a really good job of looking at that, and there's improvables at all those position groups that can help us get better in that area. In the pass game as well, I think we have explosive players. We need to create more explosive plays, and that comes through scheme, that comes through execution, that comes through designing it week in and week out to make sure that we're exploiting all those opportunities that we get from a game-to-game basis.
Good stuff there from Dan Pitcher. Like you said there, I think he did kind of turn the question on me. And by the way, that was a strategy for me because I was going to ask about what I wanted to, or what they wanted to improve on. And I wanted to get to that. I also didn't want to get there yet. And so I asked about the positives, and yet he brought up the stuff they want to improve on, and explosives. And when I hear that, and I hear about the running back part of it, when I think about the Brock Bowers part of it, I think they will be all in on some of these explosive running backs and be really interested in them in this draft. I think they will be really open to a guy like Brock Bowers if he were somewhere there at 18, because he's going to help with those explosives. I do think that a Malachi Corley is interesting because size-wise, he might not fit exactly what they've done, and we'll see what he measures at, all that stuff. But I haven't seen the measurements, but he may not fit exactly what they've done in the past, who they've targeted. But I think it makes a lot of sense for this offense, especially with T. Higgins set to be on the roster, Jake. So, but to your point, it was a good answer by Dan.
And I liked the explanation for the run game stuff quite a bit, and talking about, straining to finish a block a little bit more, the quarterback getting into the right checks, the running back making the right decisions, the wide receivers blocking well on the perimeter, just really highlighting that it is the entire unit that we're talking about in the run game for the Bengals. And there are improvements needed at each of those spots, including the running back taking a 7-yard gain and being able to turn that into a 15+ yard gain. And that's where you talk about the explosive running backs in this class. When you say that, my mind immediately goes to Jalen Wright right now from Tennessee. That's the guy that pops to mind for me, is the guy who's like the explosive back in this class that we're going to be talking about probably pretty early next week after we see him run his 40 in Indy, whenever the running backs run. I don't know when exactly that is, but I did find that to be really interesting. And then the reference to EPA and context specific stuff was also something that really stood out to me in that quote. And it kind of tells you the approach that the NFL is starting to take, using more of the analytics that kind of do incorporate context, success rate, some things that we talked about with this offense. Those were down last year. Pitcher kind of calling them an efficient running offense. I don't think they were really there last year, but 2 years ago, they certainly were, even though the numbers weren't necessarily gaudy. The success rate was good. The EPA per run were still good. So they were finding the right times to push those buttons. They have to get back to that. They have to, like he said, find the parts of their running game that were working well. And I think Zach said this too, something that they'll get through in training camp is evaluating what's working and kind of go in that direction based on personnel changes and stuff like that. But a lot of really interesting little tidbits in that answer, which is why I wanted to share that with our listeners and highlight it, because from the explosiveness element to the detail to the tools they're using to the analytic approach, I think there's a lot of cool pieces there that he talked about.
For sure. And other stuff, other highlights, I would say, and it goes into the offensive line room and what could they do at 18. He knows he's very well aware of how deep this offensive tackle class is. And I think that's something that has obviously been a theme of the offseason up to this point. But I think the Bengals view it that way too, that there are some really good guys at the top of this draft class. Now, are they still evaluating them? Absolutely. How hard is it to find a plug-and-play starting right tackle? I asked Frank Pollock that, and he was like, yeah, in any draft, even in these deep drafts, it's hard to do. And so I tried to get him to admit that he wanted a veteran as well, and he said, go ask Duke. So that didn't work out when I asked Frank that on Wednesday. But overall, I think obviously when you talk about explosive plays and all of those things, we'll spend time on the skill guys, but they still have offensive line questions, and that's where a lot of people are at. And I do think that the Bengals share the thought that this offensive tackle class is pretty deep. And the other thing that Dan mentioned, just to go back to him, and he didn't really want to talk about value, but he kept talking about the pocket and keeping the pocket for Burrow and having the stronger offensive linemen, the more powerful guys, because I'm sure he's seen the athleticism stuff being talked about. And obviously if they could find a prospect that has it all, they would love that. At the same time, I think when you're looking in free agency, when you're not drafting in the top 5-ish, it's hard to find that tackle that has it all, or that offensive lineman that has it all. You can do it, of course, and that's what they're going to try to do. But I certainly think that's noteworthy.
I don't even know if he's there in this class, period. Like the Penei Sewell level offensive tackle prospect. I know Joe Alt is a fantastic prospect, but if you look at the criticisms of Joe Alt, it's anchor related, it's size related. It said he's too finesse. It said he's a technician, kind of like Dan's talking about, where you kind of give up a little bit of athleticism to get the strength most times, not always. Those guys at the top, the Trent Williams, Penei Sewells of the world, are unicorns for a reason. And I don't know if that guy is in this draft, but that doesn't mean that they're not some really good tackles. So maybe it's Olu Fashanu. Maybe it is that Fashanu can eventually turn into that in the NFL, where he can take his athletic gifts. Maybe it is Joe Alt. Maybe it's, Amarius Mims, who hardly played in college and has all the tools you could ever want. Maybe one of those guys does put it together at the next level. But to your point, James, there certainly needs to be an acknowledgement that it's an incredible tackle class. There will be a ton of them picked in the first round, whether the Bengals get one or not. We'll see. But it is interesting to hear them talk about it, to talk about how the pocket needs to be constructed, to hear how Dan Pitcher is thinking about building inside out and the emphasis on the firmness in the middle of the pocket, not giving up ground there, because that is a common criticism, is that the Bengals offensive interior on the line is giving up too much ground in their pass sets, period. And I thought that was an interesting point that he made, given what we've seen from them from a technique perspective the last few years, where it seems like that's maybe a little bit intentional. They're inviting guys a little bit too far upfield on the interior. And he specifically talked about that in relation to the quarterback they have, and talked about that as a Joe Burrow specific kind of thing.
Sure. Of course. The quarterback wants to sit there and throw darts. You want to protect him and do that. And so I do think that they're evaluating that. One other note from Frank Pollock, just since we're talking about the interior, is he thought Cordell Volson, and we saw it, started slow and finished the year much, much better than he had started it. And so foot speed got brought up overall. Athleticism is obviously a question when it comes to Cordell. So everything that Frank said about Cordell is probably what a lot of people are saying about him, as far as the concerns, the ceiling, all of those things. But this team, they're going to have to add multiple offensive linemen this offseason. And obviously that right tackle job is open, But on the interior would not shock me, especially depth-wise, if they add a piece or two. Up next, let's switch gears. Let's talk about the punter. Will Brad Robbins be the Bengals punter next season? What does Darrin Simmons think about adding a punter, maybe a veteran in free agency? Hear from Darrin coming up next. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? Would you listen to Locked On Bengals? Would you maybe scout veteran punters and try to help Darrin Simmons find the right one? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule, including Locked On Bengals, is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. And therapy can help you find exactly what matters to you, even if it isn't your favorite podcaster. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule, even during NFL Combine week. And all you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you could switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon.
Punter is a hot topic for the Cincinnati Bengals, especially in the wake of the Super Bowl champions moving on seemingly from their punter and a notable free agent becoming available at the position. And of course, Darrin Simmons was asked about it, James.
He was. I think it's interesting that he was asked not only about adding a veteran, obviously talked about Brad Robbins, and Brad Robbins is not going to be the only punter on the Bengals roster this offseason. They're going to add a punter. And without further ado, let's hear from Darrin Simmons, on Brad Robbins and how he evaluated the rookie punter.
There's certainly a lot of room for improvement for sure. He got up to about as rough a start as you could possibly get into. We played in the opener in Cleveland. He punts 11 times. It's in the rain. And it's a difficult place to punt in the first place. So, I mean, he got off to about as, historically about the worst start you possibly could. I think he evolved some. I certainly think there's still a lot of meat left on the bone for him. If you go back and look statistically where his rookie year was in comparison, like what Kevin Huber's was, it's still better. And so I think I don't want to overreact here. I think that's part of my job is to help develop him and make him better. And so I think he can do that. I think he has the right mindset. He's very open to him, things that we bring up and techniques we might want to change a little bit to help that production. But it's certainly an area we got to get better at quick.
Competition for him?
Yeah, I would like to think that. Yeah, I mean, anytime you have competition there, I think it brings out the best. That's the little cliche thing. But yeah, I would think so.
You've gone down the road with rookie punters now 2 years in a row, kind of. Is there something to be said for a veteran presence in that competition that's more of a known quantity rather than another developmental league?
Well, I think that it depends. There's a lot of factors that go into that too. There's a salary cap that we have to deal with, and sometimes we don't. In other years we haven't had as much room to do that, and or you have a potential for some savings there by going with the younger route if they have a chance to develop. I mean, it's easy to always say, yeah, there's a veteran player that's available, and that's easy for me to say too, but sometimes that's not always feasible for our team, or what's best for our team. So, I don't know if that's where we're going to put some of our free agent or salary cap capital into a veteran player that way. I don't know that's out of the mix by any stretch of the imagination. There's some guys out there who are potentially going to be available that are very interesting. That could certainly help us. I think it's just got to be an organizational decision on where we want to move that money to.
That's interesting to me because he did.
Very interesting, as Darrin said.
That's right. It's like, well, maybe if there's enough of the pie left to go that route. At the same time, and I think he is approaching it the right way, because at the beginning of that, I'm sure a lot of people said, well, developing him, does that mean they're just going to give Robbins the job? Well, no, but they're not going to completely dismiss the idea of him being the punter that they hoped he could become. And I do think it's the right approach because they don't know if they're going to be able to get a veteran. I think that's very much in the air. They don't know how they'll assess the punters in this class. They're certainly going to add one. and where they add one, when they add one, all of those things. I think that's up in the air. I don't think it will be Drew Chrisman, for those saying, I'll just bring Drew Chrisman back. I don't think they're going there. I think they're going to find someone else and have them either compete with Brad, or if it's Tommy Townsend, that dude is punting. And he was asked about that situation later in the interview, and just the Chiefs signing an unproven guy like Matt Araiza and what it could mean for Townsend. He was like, look, Townsend wasn't as good as he was in 2022, but he's still one of the best punters in the league. So he made it clear how he feels about Townsend's talent.
And that is do we have the cap space capital to, again, use Darrin Simmons' terms, to make a move like that for an established veteran who just a couple of years ago was I think unquestionably the best punter in the NFL. He's right that last year every single punter statistic, because I looked at this for some reason, was down for Townsend when he was released. And that's why I think, in addition to money, the Chiefs went for the former Bills punter Matt Araiza, whose only NFL punt was a preseason punt that went 82 yards and was a touchback. So 62-yard net. You're allowed to kick touchbacks when the punt goes 82 yards, I guess. That's why the Chiefs moved on. But that, to Darren's point, if you still think that's one of the best punters in the NFL, if you can make it work, wouldn't it be nice to not be talking about a punter? I mean, this is 3-4 years now. I'm probably more sick of talking about punting issues for the Bengals than you are sick of talking about offensive line issues and pass blocking issues for the Cincinnati Bengals, just because one of those things is much more important than the other. And the fact that they can't get it right, despite having spent a draft pick on Brad Robbins. And you know how I feel about drafting specialists. It is frustrating, to say the least, at this point.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think they'll make a move. They'll make a move. By the way, the future Hall of Fame kicker Evan McPherson disagrees with you about drafting specialists. They can certainly work, but
it can work. But like I say, every
you gotta
time
be
this
good
comes
at
up,
it.
if anyone's new and hasn't heard me talk about this before, I'll just say this again because it comes up a lot somehow. I don't know how we talk about drafting kickers so much, kickers or punters, but the NFL historically is not better at identifying kickers in the draft than they are as undrafted free agents. So you look around the NFL, the guys that are drafted are statistically, there's no difference overall between the undrafted kickers in the league and the drafted kickers in the league. Also true for punters. They provide marginal value for a team, but the reason the Bengals have spent these picks there recently is because it's been such a problem, and they feel that pressure to get it right. And unfortunately, when you miss the pick, and maybe Brad Robbins bounces back this year and is a punter for the Bengals for the next 10 years. When you miss the pick, boy, do you feel it, because not only do you not have a swing at a player at a position that could turn into something like a viable corner or linebacker or whatever, guard, you have a punter who didn't work.
Yeah, I get that. You know who did work? My man, Money Mac. But this isn't about Money Mac, who, like I said, get that gold jacket ready. Get that gold jacket ready. You think I will say Darrin Simmons did talk about Evan McPherson's season.
Yeah.
And he said he's never been more confident in any of his specialists in the clutch. It's the most confident he's been in any player he's coached in the clutch, which I totally agree with.
Yeah.
And Evan was awesome. And they asked him to do a lot. He mentioned that as well. A lot of attempts of 50 plus. And it's because he's such a weapon that they'll put him out there in tough situations. So to your point, I agree with you. This year especially, you can't draft one. Maybe you pay one. You can certainly sign one, whether it's undrafted or sign a veteran to compete. You don't necessarily have to pay Tommy Townsend. There are other options. And so we'll see what they do, but they have to figure it out. There's no doubt about it, because they figured out Kyle Adamitis. They figured out Evan McPherson. They need to figure out that punting job for sure.
Needs to get better. Just like a few other things that we're going to talk about throughout the combine week. We're going to be talking about these offensive linemen as they go through testing. We're going to be talking about Jalen Wright again, who threatens. He's in the list of guys that could threaten John Ross's 40-time record. He's a running back, which is a pretty exciting prospect for a team looking for explosiveness of running back. So we'll talk about plenty of other issues the Bengals have to fix or could improve next week. When we come back, we'll have some combine testing to talk about. We'll have more news to talk about, I'm sure, because that's how the combine tends to work. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.